London, 1855. The Duke of Stratham detested the London season with every fibre of his being. Sebastian Inglebrook, 8th Duke of Stratham, stood at the edge of Lady Howerton's ballroom, a flute of champagne dangling from his fingers as he surveyed the crowded room with thinly veiled disdain. The chandeliers cast their golden glow upon the assembly of England's finest society, a collection of ambitious mamas, preening debutantes, and fortune hunters, all of whom had descended upon London with military precision for the commencement of another season. "You appear positively murderous, Stratham," drawled Viscount Pembury, materializing at Sebastian's side. "One might think you were facing the gallows rather than merely attending a ball." Sebastian's mouth curled into a grimace. "The comparison is not entirely inaccurate. I find myself similarly trapped with no avenue of escape." "Come now," Pembury chuckled. "Your grace period of mourning has ended. You've avoided matrimonial pursuits for 3 years since inheriting the title. Your duty to the dukedom cannot be postponed indefinitely." Sebastian drained his champagne in one swift motion. "I am acutely aware of my obligations, thank you. The estate requires an heir, and to obtain an heir, I must acquire a duchess." He placed his empty glass on a passing footman's tray. "A simple transaction, is it not? One need not involve sentiment in matters of succession." "Spoken like a true duke," Pembury said, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "And which of these lovely creatures has captured your practical interest? Lady Cecilia, perhaps? Or the Fairmont girl? They say her dowry would restore even Stratham's depleted coffers." Sebastian's jaw tightened. The state of his finances was not common knowledge, but the aristocracy had a talent for uncovering weakness like vultures detecting carrion. His father's gambling debts and his brother's profligate lifestyle before his untimely death had left the dukedom in precarious circumstances, a fact he had worked tirelessly to conceal. "I require a woman of impeccable lineage, proper education, and dignified restraint," Sebastian replied, his voice low and controlled. "Someone who understands the responsibilities of her position and will not disgrace the Stratham name with frivolity or scandal." "How utterly romantic," Pembury said with mock solemnity. "I'm certain the lady who meets your exacting requirements will be positively overcome with passion at your proposal." Sebastian ignored his friend's sarcasm. Passion was an indulgence he could not afford, not when the future of his family name and the livelihoods of hundreds of tenants rested upon his shoulders. He had witnessed firsthand the disaster that befell estates when dukes chose with their hearts rather than their heads. His father had loved his mother desperately, so desperately that when she died, he had sought comfort in gambling and drink, leaving the dukedom in ruins. No, Sebastian would not repeat those mistakes. He would select a duchess as one might select a brood mare, for pedigree, temperament, and the likelihood of producing healthy offspring. It was the only sensible approach. "Your Grace," simpered Lady Howerton, approaching with a nervous young woman in tow. "May I present my niece, Lady Philippa Wentworth? She has just returned from finishing school in Paris and is most accomplished on the pianoforte." Sebastian executed a perfect bow, his face arranged in a mask of polite interest. "Lady Philippa, a pleasure." The girl curtsied, her face flushing a brilliant crimson. "Your Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the orchestra. Lady Howerton beamed. "Perhaps your Grace would honor Philippa with a dance. She has been practicing her quadrille most assiduously." "I would be delighted," Sebastian replied automatically, though the thought of navigating another stilted conversation with a debutante filled him with profound weariness. As he led Lady Philippa to the dance floor, Sebastian resigned himself to his fate. By the end of the season, he would be engaged. The Stratham bloodline would continue, the estate would be secured, and he would have fulfilled his duty. If he felt a hollow emptiness at the prospect of a marriage devoid of genuine affection, well, such was the burden of his rank. What Sebastian could not possibly have foreseen was that his carefully ordered plans were about to be thoroughly irrevocably dismantled by a pair of intelligent brown eyes belonging to the most unsuitable woman in London. Beatrice Lowell hurried through the servants' entrance of Howerton House, clutching her wooden sewing case to her chest. She was late, unforgivably late, for Lady Howerton had specifically requested her presence by 7 o'clock to mend Lady Philippa's gown before the ball commenced. A loose seam had been discovered at the last moment, and Beatrice, as the most skilled seamstress in Mrs. Winterbottom's dress shop, had been summoned for the emergency. "There you are, girl, Mrs. Fletcher, the housekeeper, exclaimed as Beatrice entered the bustling kitchen. "Lady Howerton has been asking for you these 20 minutes past. Lady Philippa is in quite a state." "I'm terribly sorry," Beatrice apologized, breathless from her hurried walk across London. "There was an accident in Oxford Street, a carriage overturned, and no hansom could pass for nearly half an hour." Mrs. Fletcher clicked her tongue. "Well, never mind that now. Come along, quickly." Beatrice followed the housekeeper up the servants' staircase, her heart pounding. She could not afford to lose Mrs. Winterbottom's custom. At 6:20, with no fortune or family connections to speak of, her nimble fingers were her only source of livelihood. They reached Lady Philippa's chamber, where the young debutante was dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief while her lady's maid attempted to console her. "Miss Lowell has arrived, my lady," Mrs. Fletcher announced. Lady Philippa turned, her pretty face blotched with tears. "Oh, thank goodness. My gown, the seam has split at the shoulder, and I'm to dance with the Duke of Stratham himself tonight." "Let me see, my lady," Beatrice said calmly, setting down her case and approaching the damaged gown. The split seam was minor, a matter of 10 minutes' work at most. "This can be mended easily. If you'll allow me to begin immediately, you needn't delay your entrance to the ball." Lady Philippa's relief was palpable. "Oh, would you? Mamma says the Duke is exceedingly punctual and would consider tardiness a grave offence." Beatrice smiled reassuringly as she threaded her needle. "We shall have you downstairs before His Grace even notices your absence." As Beatrice worked, her fingers moving with practiced precision, Lady Philippa prattled on about the importance of tonight's ball. "They say the Duke is finally seeking a bride," she confided, her voice hushed with excitement. "After 3 years of mourning his brother, he's determined to secure the succession. Mamma says I must make an excellent impression, for a duchess's coronet would be the making of our family." "I'm certain you shall charm him completely," Beatrice replied, careful to keep her tone appropriately deferential. It was not her place to offer opinions on the marital prospects of the nobility. "Do you think so?" Lady Philippa asked anxiously. "He's said to be terribly severe, cold as ice and twice as hard. The Marble Duke, some call him." Beatrice bit back a smile at the dramatic description. The aristocracy, in her experience, were merely people draped in finer fabrics, no more or less capable of human feeling than those who served them. "There," she said, tying off her thread with a neat knot. "The repair is complete, my lady. No one will notice it was ever damaged." Lady Philippa examined her shoulder in the mirror. "Oh, Miss Lowell, you are a marvel. One cannot see the mending at all." "That is the highest compliment a seamstress can receive," Beatrice replied with a modest smile. "Shall I help your lady's maid dress you now? We've still time to ensure everything is perfect." 15 minutes later, Lady Philippa descended to the ballroom on her mother's arm, resplendent in pale blue silk that complemented her fair colouring perfectly. Beatrice, having completed her task, should have departed immediately. Yet curiosity, always her besetting sin, compelled her to linger. Just a glimpse of this formidable duke who struck fear into debutantes' hearts would surely do no harm. She slipped through the servants' corridors to a small gallery overlooking the ballroom, where the upper staff sometimes observed proceedings to better anticipate their employer's needs. From this vantage point, Beatrice could see the entire assembly in all its glittering splendor. Her gaze swept the room, searching for Lady Philippa's pale blue gown and found her just as she curtsied before a tall gentleman in immaculate evening dress. This, then, must be the fearsome Duke of Stratham. Beatrice studied him with objective interest. He was handsome in a severe, classical way, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and a mouth that appeared unaccustomed to smiling. His posture was impeccable, his movements precise and elegant as he led Lady Philippa onto the dance floor. The marble duke indeed, she thought with amusement. As the dance progressed, Beatrice found herself transfixed by the curious emptiness in the duke's expression. While he performed the steps flawlessly, there was a mechanical quality to his participation, as though he were a clockwork figure wound up to perform a specific function. His eyes, even from this distance, she could see they were a striking blue, remained distant, revealing nothing of the man behind the title. How lonely it must be, she thought suddenly, to move through life so completely separated from genuine human connection. The music ended, and the Duke returned Lady Philippa to her mother with a formal bow. As he straightened, his gaze unexpectedly lifted toward the gallery where Beatrice stood. For one startling moment, their eyes met across the distance, blue ice meeting warm brown, and Beatrice felt an inexplicable jolt, as though she had touched a lightning rod during a storm. She stepped back hastily, heart racing at the impropriety of being caught watching. She had no business observing the nobility as though they were characters in a play staged for her entertainment. With a self-deprecating shake of her head, Beatrice gathered her sewing case and slipped away, dismissing the peculiar moment as a trick of the light and her own fanciful imagination. Little did she know that the Duke of Stratham, standing rigid among the cream of society, found himself strangely disquieted by a pair of intelligent brown eyes that had regarded him not with awe or ambition, but with something far more unsettling, understanding. Sebastian found himself unable to focus on Lady Throckmorton's detailed recitation of her daughter's accomplishments. His attention kept drifting to the upper gallery, where he had glimpsed a face that did not belong among the ton, a woman with clear brown eyes that had seemed to look through his carefully constructed facade. "Your Grace," Lady Throckmorton prompted, her tone suggesting this was not the first time she had attempted to recapture his attention. "Forgive me," Sebastian said smoothly. "I find the heat of the ballroom somewhat oppressive. Perhaps a turn about the room would be refreshing." Before the lady could respond, he offered his arm with such automatic courtesy that she could not refuse without causing a scene. As they promenaded along the perimeter of the dance floor, Sebastian surreptitiously glanced toward the gallery, but the woman had vanished. "As I was saying, Lavinia is exceptionally accomplished," Lady Throckmorton continued. "Her watercolors were much admired at the exhibition in Bath last season, and her French is so flawless that Madame de Verot herself commented upon it." Sebastian made appropriate noises of appreciation, while his mind wandered. Who was the woman in the gallery? Not a guest, certainly. Her simple attire had marked her as someone of the working class. A servant, perhaps, though most would not dare observe the proceedings so openly. "Lord Pembrey approaches," Lady Throckmorton observed, her tone cooling noticeably. The Viscount's reputation for rakish behavior made him unwelcome in the company of unmarried daughters. "Stratham," Pembrey said, executing a bow that skirted the edge of propriety in its casualness. "Lady Throckmorton, you are looking exceptionally well this evening." The matron's lips thinned. "Lord Pembrey, I trust you are enjoying the season's festivities." "Immensely," he replied with a wolfish grin, "though I've come to steal his grace away momentarily. Lord Hartington is most anxious to discuss the bill before Parliament regarding the railway expansion." It was a transparent fabrication. Hartington was notoriously uninterested in politics, but Sebastian seized the opportunity. "You must excuse me, Lady Throckmorton. Duty calls." Once they were safely beyond earshot, Sebastian muttered, "I am in your debt." The lady was determined to secure a dance for her daughter. "And you were distracted enough to nearly agree," Pembrey observed shrewdly. What has captured the attention of the ever-vigilant Duke of Stratham? Not Lady Philippa's insipid conversation, surely. I merely observed someone unexpected in the upper gallery, Sebastian replied, deliberately vague. It was nothing of consequence. Pembrey's eyebrows rose. Unexpected, in Howerton House. Do tell. There is nothing to tell, Sebastian insisted, irritated by his friend's persistence. A servant, I presume, watching the proceedings. It was merely unusual. A female servant, by your heightened colour, Pembrey teased. The marble duke, undone by a glimpse of a pretty housemaid. How the mighty have fallen. Sebastian's jaw tightened. Your imagination exceeds even your reputation for absurdity. I noticed her because she seemed out of place, nothing more. Before Pembrey could continue his needling, a commotion near the refreshment table drew their attention. Lady Philippa stood in evident distress, her hand clutching at her shoulder where the pale blue silk of her gown had once again come apart at the seam. "Oh, where is that seamstress?" Lady Howerton exclaimed, attempting to shield her niece from curious onlookers. "She assured us the repair would hold." Sebastian watched as Lady Philippa was hastily escorted from the ballroom, tears streaming down her face at the public embarrassment. He felt a twinge of sympathy for the girl. Her first encounter with the ton had ended in humiliation through no fault of her own. "Poor creature," Pembrey murmured. "The vultures will be discussing this for weeks." Sebastian frowned. A loose seam is hardly grounds for social ruin. "Perhaps not for a duke," Pembrey replied, "but for a debutante seeking to make an advantageous match, such a mishap can be devastating, particularly when it occurs during a dance with the season's most eligible bachelor." Sebastian had not considered this perspective. The rigid social hierarchy that served him so well could be mercilessly unforgiving to those with less power and privilege. It was a system he had never thought to question until now. "If you'll excuse me," he said to Pembrey, "I believe I shall take some air in the garden. The evening has grown tedious." Sebastian made his way through the French doors onto the terrace, inhaling deeply as the cool night air cleared his head. The manicured gardens stretched before him, illuminated by strategically placed lanterns that cast pools of golden light among the shadows. As he descended the steps to the gravel path, he caught sight of a solitary figure seated on a stone bench near the ornamental pond. The light from a nearby lantern revealed a woman bent over what appeared to be a length of pale blue fabric. With a start of recognition, Sebastian realized it was the woman from the gallery, and she was working intently on Lady Philippa's damaged gown. Curiosity propelled him forward before good sense could intervene. Beatrice had not gotten far when Mrs. Fletcher intercepted her in the corridor, her expression harried. "Thank heavens you haven't left yet," the housekeeper exclaimed. "There's been a disaster. Lady Philippa's gown has torn again, and worse than before. Lady Howerton is beside herself." Dismay flooded Beatrice. "But that's impossible. The stitching was secure. I used a reinforced French seam." "Well, secure or not, it's torn from shoulder to elbow now, and the young lady is inconsolable. You're to come at once and repair it if you can." Gathering her sewing case, Beatrice followed Mrs. Fletcher to a small anteroom where Lady Philippa sat weeping, while her lady's maid attempted to console her. "Miss Lowell is here, my lady," Mrs. Fletcher announced. Lady Howerton turned, her face tight with displeasure. "You assured us the repair was sufficient, Miss Lowell. Now my niece has been humiliated before the entire assembly, including the Duke of Stratham himself." Beatrice curtsied low. "I offer my sincerest apologies, my lady. May I examine the gown to see what occurred?" Lady Philippa had been helped out of the damaged garment, which now lay across a chair. Beatrice approached it with professional concern, immediately identifying the problem. "This is not a failure of the seam, my lady," she said carefully. "The fabric itself has torn adjacent to my repair. See how the silk has frayed. This suggests that the material was strained beyond its capacity." Lady Howerton's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting my niece is to blame?" "Not at all," Beatrice hastened to clarify. "Merely that the delicate nature of the silk was perhaps not equal to the movement required by the dance. A more robust fabric would be advisable for ball gowns." "Can it be mended?" Lady Philippa asked tearfully. "I cannot face returning to the ballroom in a different gown. Everyone would know of my disgrace." Beatrice examined the tear carefully. "I can repair it, my lady, but it will require more substantial reinforcement. The work will take at least half an hour, possibly longer." Lady Howerton sighed heavily. "Very well, proceed with all haste. Philippa shall claim a mild headache necessitated her brief retirement. Half the company is already speculating about her chances with the Duke. This mishap must not be permitted to ruin her prospects." Left alone with the damaged gown, Beatrice set to work with focused precision. The tear was worse than she had initially assessed. The fine silk had shredded along the stress points where the fitted sleeve joined the bodice. It would require not just mending, but structural reinforcement if Lady Philippa were to continue dancing without further incident. The small anteroom felt stifling as Beatrice worked. On impulse, she gathered the gown and her supplies, slipping through a side door that led to the garden. The night air would clear her head, and the lanterns provided sufficient light for her detailed work. She found a secluded bench near the ornamental pond and settled herself, spreading the gown across her lap. The distant strains of the orchestra provided a gentle accompaniment as her needle flashed in and out of the delicate silk. Beatrice was so absorbed in her task that she did not notice the approach of footsteps on the gravel path until a deep voice startled her from her concentration. "Is that Lady Philippa's gown?" She looked up with a gasp, nearly pricking her finger. Before her stood a tall gentleman in impeccable evening dress, the Duke of Stratham himself, his severe features thrown into sharp relief by the lantern light. Beatrice scrambled to her feet, dropping into a hasty curtsy. "Your Grace, I beg your pardon, I did not hear you approach." The Duke regarded her with an unreadable expression. "You are the seamstress, I presume?" "Yes, Your Grace. Beatrice Lowell, from Mrs. Winterbottom's dress shop on Bond Street." "And you were also the woman observing from the gallery earlier this evening?" It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Beatrice felt heat rise to her cheeks at being caught in her impropriety. "I apologize for that, Your Grace. It was unconscionably intrusive of me. I merely wished to ensure Lady Philippa's gown performed as expected during her dance." Something that might have been amusement flickered briefly in his eyes. "Given subsequent events, your vigilance was apparently warranted, if ultimately ineffective." Beatrice straightened her shoulders slightly at the implied criticism. "The failure was not in my stitching, Your Grace, but in the fabric itself. Silk of this weight is beautiful but fragile, particularly when subjected to the vigorous movements of a quadrille." She bit her lip, suddenly aware that she had spoken with undue frankness to a duke. "Forgive me. It is not my place to offer opinions." To her surprise, the Duke did not appear offended. Instead, he studied her with increased interest, as though she were a peculiar specimen he had not previously encountered. "You speak with the authority of expertise, Miss Lowell. I find that preferable to meek deference in matters where one possesses superior knowledge." He gestured to the bench. "Pray, continue your work. Lady Philippa will be anxious to return to the ballroom." Beatrice hesitated, uncertain of the propriety of sitting while a duke remained standing, yet equally conscious that the repair could not be completed otherwise. After a moment's indecision, she resumed her seat, balancing the gown carefully across her lap. To her astonishment, the Duke lowered himself onto the opposite end of the stone bench, maintaining a proper distance but creating an utterly improper tableau, a duke and a seamstress sharing a garden bench in the moonlight. "May I inquire as to the nature of the damage?" he asked, his tone conversational, as though they were discussing the weather over tea. Beatrice cleared her throat. The silk has torn along the stress points of the bodice-to-sleeve seam. I am reinforcing it with an underlayer of sturdy cotton and a specialized stitch that will allow flexibility without further tearing. Ingenious, he remarked. I confess, I have given little thought to the construction of ladies' garments beyond their aesthetic effect. Few gentlemen do, Your Grace, Beatrice replied, her needle moving in a steady rhythm. Yet the engineering of formal attire is quite complex, particularly for ladies, who must appear effortlessly graceful while encased in whalebone and layers of fabric designed more for appearance than function. A faint smile touched the Duke's lips, the first Beatrice had seen from him. It transformed his austere features, softening the harsh lines and hinting at a different man beneath the formal exterior. You speak as though you consider fashion a form of architectural constraint rather than an art. Perhaps a bit of both, Beatrice answered thoughtfully. There is artistry in the design, certainly, but also practical mathematics in the construction. A gown must be beautiful, yes, but it must also allow its wearer to breathe, move, and sit without discomfort or disaster. The Duke regarded her with undisguised curiosity. You are unusually well-spoken for a seamstress, Miss Lowell. Beatrice's hands stilled momentarily. My father was a schoolmaster, Your Grace. He believed education should not be limited by gender or circumstance. He taught me alongside his male pupils until his death 10 years ago. And then reality intruded upon principle, she said simply. My mother had died years before. There was no money for further education, so I apprenticed to a dressmaker who had admired my needlework. It has proven a respectable and practical profession. The Duke was silent for a moment, his expression contemplative. Your father sounds like a man of progressive ideas. He was, Beatrice agreed, her voice softening with memory, though he would have said he was merely practical. An educated mind is never wasted, regardless of the body that houses it. That was his philosophy. A philosophy at odds with current social conventions, the Duke observed. Beatrice looked up from her stitching, meeting his gaze directly. Many worthwhile things are at odds with convention, Your Grace. For a long moment, they regarded each other in silence, an unexpected current of understanding passing between them. Then, as though suddenly recalling himself, the Duke rose to his feet. I have detained you from your work long enough, Miss Lowell. Lady Philippa will be eager to rejoin the festivities. Beatrice nodded, dropping her gaze back to her needle. The repair is nearly complete, Your Grace. Then I shall bid you good evening. He hesitated, then added with formal courtesy, It has been illuminating to make your acquaintance. Likewise, Your Grace, she replied, dipping her head in acknowledgement. As his footsteps receded along the gravel path, Beatrice released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The encounter had been brief, unexpected, and utterly improper, yet she could not suppress a strange feeling of exhilaration, as though something significant had occurred that she could not yet identify. Shaking her head at her own fanciful thoughts, Beatrice returned her attention to Lady Philippa's gown. Whatever momentary connection she might have imagined with the Duke of Stratham was merely an aberration, a curious interlude that would never be repeated. Life, after all, was not a fairy tale where seamstresses conversed as equals with dukes. It was a practical business of knowing one's place and fulfilling one's duties with competence and dignity. With that firmly in mind, Beatrice completed her repair and rose to return to the house, leaving the moonlit garden and its brief enchantment behind. 3 days after the Howerton ball, Sebastian found himself in the unprecedented position of loitering on Bond Street like a lovesick youth. He had dismissed his carriage and sent his valet on an errand, allowing himself the unusual freedom of walking unaccompanied through London's fashionable shopping district. His ostensible purpose, selecting a gift for his aunt's upcoming birthday, provided a thin veneer of respectability to what he knew was, in truth, an inexcusable lapse in judgment. The Duke of Stratham did not happen by dress shops. He summoned tradespeople to his home when their services were required. Yet here he stood, pausing before the modest but elegant facade of Mrs. Winterbottom's establishment, attempting to formulate a plausible reason to enter. "Your Grace," Lady Carlisle's shrill voice shattered his contemplation. "What a delightful surprise to encounter you in such unexpected surroundings." Sebastian suppressed a grimace as he turned to greet the ambitious matron and her daughter, both laden with parcels from their morning's shopping expedition. "Lady Carlisle, Miss Carlisle," he acknowledged with a formal bow. "I trust you are enjoying the fine weather." "Indeed we are," Lady Carlisle simpered, nudging her daughter forward. "Amelia has just been fitted for the most exquisite gown for the Pembury ball. Perhaps we might have the honor of your company during a dance that evening." Before Sebastian could formulate a non-committal response, the door to Mrs. Winterbottom's shop opened, and a familiar figure emerged, carrying a large parcel wrapped in brown paper and string. Beatrice Lowell. She froze momentarily upon seeing him, her expressive eyes widening in surprise. Then, recovering her composure, she executed a neat curtsy to the assembled company. "Your Grace, Lady Carlisle, Miss Carlisle," she murmured, her voice soft but clear. Lady Carlisle's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "You are acquainted with this person, Your Grace." The subtle emphasis on person carried a wealth of disdainful implication. Sebastian felt an unexpected surge of irritation at the lady's tone. "Miss Lowell performed an exceptional repair for Lady Philippa Wentworth during the Howerton ball," he replied, his voice deliberately formal. "Her skill prevented what might have been a most unfortunate social embarrassment." Beatrice's cheeks colored slightly at this public acknowledgement, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "You are too kind, Your Grace. If you'll excuse me, I must deliver this package to Lady Pembury before noon." "Of course," Sebastian replied, finding himself reluctant to end the encounter. "Perhaps." But Lady Carlisle had already dismissed Beatrice from her attention and pressed forward. "Your Grace, we were just discussing the delightful musicale at Lady Sefton's tomorrow evening. Might we hope for the pleasure of your company?" Trapped by propriety, Sebastian watched from the corner of his eye as Beatrice slipped away into the crowd, her brown dress and sensible bonnet quickly disappearing among the colorful fashions of Bond Street's wealthier patrons. "Regrettably, I have a prior engagement," he told Lady Carlisle, suddenly desperate to extricate himself from the conversation. "If you'll excuse me, ladies, I have an appointment that requires my attention." Without waiting for a response, Sebastian executed a brief bow and strode purposefully in the direction Beatrice had taken. It was unconscionably rude behavior from a man of his position, but he found he could not summon the appropriate degree of remorse. He caught sight of her at the corner where Bond Street met Piccadilly, her pace brisk but unhurried as she navigated through the pedestrian traffic with practiced ease. Sebastian increased his stride, closing the distance between them. "Miss Lowell," he called, causing several passers-by to turn in surprise at the sound of a duke addressing a working woman in public. Beatrice stopped, turning with evident confusion. "Your Grace." Sebastian reached her side, suddenly aware that he had no legitimate reason for this pursuit. Improvising rapidly, he said, "I wish to inquire whether you might be available for a commission. My aunt, Lady Harrington, celebrates her birthday next week, and I had thought perhaps a new shawl or," he faltered, realizing he knew nothing about what items might be appropriate. Beatrice regarded him with a mixture of perplexity and caution. "Mrs. Winterbottom's shop would be honored to serve Lady Harrington, Your Grace, but I am merely an employee. Such commissions would properly be discussed with Mrs. Winterbottom herself." "Of course," Sebastian agreed, feeling uncharacteristically foolish. "However, having witnessed the quality of your workmanship firsthand, I would specifically request your involvement in the project." A hint of a smile touched her lips. "That is most flattering, Your Grace, but I must deliver this package to Lady Pembury without delay. Perhaps you might call at the shop this afternoon to discuss your requirements with Mrs. Winterbottom. Yes, I shall do exactly that, Sebastian replied, seizing upon the suggested course of action with relief. I apologize for delaying your errand. Beatrice studied him for a moment, her brown eyes reflecting a keen intelligence that seemed to see beyond his ducal facade. No apology necessary, Your Grace. Good day to you. With a brief curtsy, she continued on her way, leaving Sebastian standing in the middle of Piccadilly with the distinct impression that he had just behaved like a complete fool, and the even more disconcerting realization that he did not particularly regret it. Beatrice could feel curious eyes following her as she hurried away from her unexpected encounter with the Duke of Stratham. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, not at his attention, but at the spectacle they had surely created. A duke conversing with a seamstress on a public street was the sort of occurrence that generated gossip, and gossip was the last thing a woman in her position could afford. As she delivered Lady Pembury's package to the townhouse on Grosvenor Square, Beatrice tried to make sense of the Duke's peculiar behaviour. Surely he could not have been serious about commissioning work for his aunt. Aristocrats of his standing patronized the grand establishments on Regent Street, not modest shops like Mrs. Winterbottom's, which catered primarily to the gentry and wealthy merchant class. Yet there had been something in his manner, an awkwardness at odds with his usual commanding presence, that suggested his approach had been genuine, if perhaps impulsive. "You're being ridiculous," she muttered to herself as she made her way back to Bond Street. Dukes do not develop sudden interest in seamstresses. He likely wished to ensure Lady Philippa's gown repair had been satisfactory, nothing more. When Beatrice returned to the shop, she found Mrs. Winterbottom in a state of barely contained excitement. "There you are, my dear," the older woman exclaimed, clasping her plump hands together. "The most extraordinary thing has occurred. The Duke of Stratham himself has placed an order for a birthday gift for his aunt, Lady Harrington." Beatrice froze in the act of removing her bonnet. "His Grace has been here." "Indeed he has," Mrs. Winterbottom confirmed, her cheeks flushed with pleasure. "Not half an hour after you departed with Lady Pembury's package. And most astonishing of all, he specifically requested that you be assigned to create the embroidered shawl he has commissioned." "Me," Beatrice echoed faintly. "He was most insistent. Said he had observed your work during some emergency repair and was impressed by your skill and artistry." Mrs. Winterbottom peered at Beatrice curiously. "You neglected to mention you had performed a service for the Duke of Stratham, my dear." Beatrice hung her bonnet on the peg by the door, using the moment to compose herself. "It was a minor repair at the Howerton ball. Lady Philippa Wentworth's gown suffered a tear during a dance. His Grace happened to be present when I explained the nature of the damage to Lady Howerton." It was not precisely a lie, though it omitted their moonlit conversation in the garden. Mrs. Winterbottom appeared satisfied with this explanation. "Well, whatever the circumstances, it has resulted in a most prestigious commission. The Duke has selected the finest cashmere wool for the shawl and has requested an elaborate design incorporating his aunt's favorite flowers, lilies and roses. The price he has agreed to is most generous." Beatrice nodded, attempting to process this unexpected development. "When does His Grace require the completed piece?" "By Thursday next. Lady Harrington's birthday celebration is that evening." Mrs. Winterbottom smiled apologetically. "I know it's a challenging time frame, but I assured His Grace that our most talented needlewoman was equal to the task." "I shall begin at once," Beatrice said, moving toward the workroom at the back of the shop. "The embroidery pattern will require careful planning if it is to be completed in time." As she gathered her materials and began sketching design options, Beatrice tried to focus solely on the professional aspects of the commission. Yet she could not quite suppress the flicker of pleasure at the knowledge that the Duke had specifically requested her work. that their brief encounter in the garden had left enough of an impression for him to seek her out again, however indirectly. "This is merely business," she reminded herself firmly. "Nothing more than a wealthy patron appreciating skilled craftsmanship." Even as she thought it, Beatrice knew she was attempting to convince herself of something she did not quite believe. The Duke of Stratham could have commissioned a shawl from any of London's premier establishments. His choice to patronize Mrs. Winterbottom's shop and to specifically request Beatrice's services suggested motivations beyond mere appreciation of fine needlework. What those motivations might be, she could not begin to guess, and it was dangerous, she knew, to speculate. Women in her position who entertained fantasies about noblemen inevitably faced heartbreak or ruin, often both. With determined focus, Beatrice turned her attention to the embroidery design, channeling her confused emotions into creating something of exceptional beauty. If this commission represented her only connection to the intriguing Duke of Stratham, then she would ensure it was a masterpiece worthy of remembrance. Sebastian paced the length of his library, pausing occasionally to glance at the ornate clock on the mantelpiece. In precisely 30 minutes, Mrs. Winterbottom's messenger would arrive with the completed shawl for his aunt. He had instructed his butler to show the person directly to the library, an unusual directive that had earned him a briefly raised eyebrow before the servant's face resumed its customary impassivity. The past week had been an exercise in frustrated anticipation. Sebastian had attended the requisite social events of the season, dancing with appropriate young ladies and engaging in polite conversation with their ambitious mothers, all while his thoughts persistently strayed to a pair of intelligent brown eyes and forthright observations about fashion as architectural constraint. He had nearly convinced himself to make another visit to Mrs. Winterbottom's establishment under the pretext of checking on the commission's progress, but pride had intervened. The Duke of Stratham did not make unnecessary calls upon tradespeople. It would appear overeager, even desperate. And why should he be either of those things? Beatrice Lowell was a seamstress, educated and articulate, certainly, but hardly a suitable object for his continued attention. He had a dukedom to consider, an ancient name to uphold, estates to restore to prosperity. Yet he could not forget the brief moment of genuine connection he had felt in the Howerton garden, the rare experience of conversing with someone who spoke to him as a person rather than a title, who seemed to see beyond the formal facade he presented to the world. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called, composing his features into an expression of ducal impassivity. His butler appeared, announcing, "The messenger from Mrs. Winterbottom's, Your Grace." Sebastian's carefully cultivated indifference crumbled into disappointment as a young boy of perhaps 12 entered, carrying a package wrapped in fine paper and ribbon. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace," the boy said with a nervous bow. "Mrs. Winterbottom sends the shawl for Lady Harrington with her compliments and hopes it meets with your approval." Sebastian accepted the package with a curt nod. "Wait here while I examine it." He unwrapped the parcel carefully, revealing a shawl of such exquisite workmanship that even his untrained eye could recognize its exceptional quality. The fine cashmere wool was the color of cream, providing a perfect backdrop for the embroidered design of intertwining lilies and roses in shades of pale pink, deep crimson, and verdant green. The border featured an intricate pattern that, upon closer inspection, incorporated subtle references to the Stratham family crest, a thoughtful detail he had not specified in his commission. "This is remarkable," Sebastian murmured, almost to himself. The boy shifted nervously from foot to foot. "Miss Lowell worked day and night on it, Your Grace. Mrs. Winterbottom says she's never seen finer embroidery, even from the Royal School of Needlework." Sebastian's attention sharpened. Miss Lowell completed the entire piece herself. "Yes, Your Grace. She wouldn't let anyone else touch it, not even to help with the finishing. Said it had to be perfect. It did." Something warm unfurled in Sebastian's chest at this information. He crossed to his desk, wrote a brief note, and sealed it with his signet ring. Then, returning to the package, he extracted a generous sum from his pocket, far exceeding the customary gratuity for a delivery boy. "Take this to Mrs. Winterbottom with my compliments," he instructed, handing over the coins. "And this," he extended the sealed note, "is to be delivered directly and personally to Miss Lowell. Do you understand? To Miss Lowell herself, not to Mrs. Winterbottom or anyone else." The boy's eyes widened at the substantial tip. "Yes, Your Grace. I'll see Miss Lowell gets it straight away, I promise." After the boy departed, Sebastian stood for a long moment, the shawl draped across his hands. The note had been impulsive, perhaps foolish, but he could not allow such exceptional work to go unacknowledged. He had requested that Miss Lowell meet him the following afternoon in the picture gallery at the British Museum, a public venue that offered both propriety and the opportunity for private conversation. Whether she would accept his invitation remained to be seen. It was highly irregular, potentially damaging to her reputation if discovered, and certainly beyond the bounds of conventional interaction between a duke and a seamstress. Yet as he carefully rewrapped the shawl for presentation to his aunt, Sebastian found himself hoping, with an intensity that surprised him, that Beatrice Lowell might be willing to step beyond convention just this once. Beatrice stood before the imposing facade of the British Museum, her heart pounding so fiercely she feared it might be visible through her modest grey walking dress. The Duke's note, delivered the previous day by Mrs. Winterbottom's wide-eyed errand boy, had been brief but unambiguous. "Miss Lowell." The shawl exceeds all expectations and represents craftsmanship of the highest order. "I would be most gratified if you would permit me to express my appreciation in person. I shall be in the East Gallery of the British Museum tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Stratham." For hours, Beatrice had debated the wisdom of accepting this irregular invitation. Prudence dictated she should ignore it entirely. Meeting a nobleman unaccompanied was precisely the sort of behavior that led to ruined reputations and lost positions. Yet curiosity and a more complex emotion she hesitated to name compelled her toward acceptance. In the end, practicality had provided the deciding factor. The museum was a public institution, open to all citizens regardless of rank. They would be surrounded by other visitors, visible to anyone who passed through the gallery. Whatever the Duke's purpose in requesting this meeting, it could hardly involve impropriety in such a setting. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, Beatrice ascended the steps and entered the grand building. She had visited the museum several times before. Her father had believed in broadening her education through exposure to art and artifacts, but never had she approached it with such trepidation. The East Gallery housed a collection of Renaissance paintings, their gilded frames gleaming softly in the diffused light from the high windows. As Beatrice entered, her gaze immediately found the Duke of Stratham standing before a large Titian, his hands clasped behind his back in an attitude of contemplation. Even in this setting, removed from the ballrooms and drawing rooms of high society, he maintained an aura of authority that set him apart. His dark blue coat and fawn trousers were impeccably tailored, but understated, the confidence of true aristocracy requiring no ostentatious display. For a moment, Beatrice hesitated at the threshold, questioning her decision to come. Then, gathering her courage, she moved forward into the gallery. The Duke turned at the sound of her footsteps, and something in his expression, a momentary softening of his austere features, caused her pulse to quicken. "Miss Lowell," he greeted her, executing a formal bow that would have been appropriate for a lady of quality rather than a tradesman's employee. "I am gratified that you chose to come." Beatrice curtsied in response. "Your Grace." "Your note indicated satisfaction with the shawl. I am pleased it met with your approval." "Satisfaction is an inadequate term for my response to your work," he replied, his voice low to avoid disturbing the handful of other visitors scattered throughout the gallery. It was exceptional in every respect, a true work of art rather than mere craftsmanship. Warmth flooded Beatrice's cheeks at the sincere praise. "You are most kind, Your Grace." The commission was a pleasure to execute. The incorporation of elements from the Stratham crest was particularly inspired, he continued, gesturing for her to walk with him along the row of paintings. I had not specified that detail. Beatrice fell into step beside him, maintaining a proper distance. "I took the liberty of researching your family's heraldry," she admitted. "I thought Lady Harrington might appreciate the personal connection." She was delighted with the gift, the Duke confirmed. "So much so that she has commissioned me to order a second shawl for her daughter's birthday in September, if you are amenable to accepting the work." "Of course," Beatrice replied automatically, though her thoughts were in tumult. Surely the Duke had not arranged this meeting merely to commission another shawl. Such business could have been conducted through Mrs. Winterbottom without requiring Beatrice's personal attendance. As though sensing her confusion, the Duke paused before a small portrait of a Renaissance noblewoman, her serene face framed by an elaborate ruff collar. "I confess, Miss Lowell, that while my aunt's commission provided a convenient pretext, it was not my primary purpose in requesting this meeting." He turned slightly to face her, his blue eyes intent. "I found our conversation in the Howerton garden unexpectedly refreshing. You spoke with candor and intelligence on subjects beyond the usual insipid topics of ballroom discourse. I wished for the opportunity to continue our acquaintance, if only briefly and within the bounds of propriety." Beatrice stared at him, momentarily speechless. Of all the explanations she had considered for this unusual invitation, the simple desire for conversation had seemed too improbable to contemplate. I am honored by your interest, Your Grace," she finally managed, "though I confess I find it somewhat perplexing. Surely there are many individuals of suitable rank and education with whom you might engage in stimulating discourse." A faint smile touched his lips. "You would think so, would you not? Yet I find the constraints of my position generally preclude genuine conversation. People speak to the dukedom rather than the man, offering what they believe I wish to hear rather than honest opinions or original thoughts." He moved to the next painting, a dramatic biblical scene rendered in rich colors and violent movement. "You, Miss Lowell, committed the novel offense of speaking to me as though I were merely human, capable of interest in subjects beyond my title and estates." Beatrice absorbed this unexpected revelation, recognizing the loneliness it implied. How strange to think that this powerful man, whose very presence commanded deference and respect, might envy the ordinary interactions she took for granted. "I apologize if I was impertinent," she offered, though without real contrition. The Duke's smile deepened slightly. "On the contrary, your lack of sycophantic deference was precisely what I found appealing. Perhaps you might do me the favor of continued impertinence for the duration of our visit. I should welcome your unvarnished opinions on these works of art, for instance." Beatrice glanced at the dramatic painting before them, a Caravaggio depicting the moment of St. Paul's conversion. The apostle sprawled on the ground beneath his rearing horse, while divine light streamed from above. "I find Caravaggio's use of light fascinating," she said, deciding to accept the Duke's unusual invitation to speak freely. "The way he creates such dramatic contrast between darkness and illumination seems to reflect the spiritual transformation of his subject. One can almost feel the moment of revelation." The Duke studied the painting with renewed interest. "I had not considered it in those terms, but I see your point. The technique serves the narrative rather than merely displaying the artist's skill." "Precisely," Beatrice agreed, warming to the subject. "Though I confess I sometimes find religious art overwhelming in its intensity. I prefer the more intimate domestic scenes of the Dutch masters, glimpses of ordinary life elevated to something worthy of preservation and contemplation." "An interesting preference," the Duke observed. Perhaps we should proceed to the Dutch collection and test your theory. What followed was the most extraordinary afternoon of Beatrice's life. For 2 hours, she wandered through the museum's galleries with the Duke of Stratham, discussing art, history, and philosophy with a freedom she had not experienced since her father's death. The Duke listened to her opinions with genuine interest, offering thoughtful responses that revealed both education and a natural intelligence untainted by arrogance. As they stood before a Vermeer depicting a young woman reading a letter by a window, the Duke asked unexpectedly, "Do you ever regret the path your life has taken, Miss Lowell? Given your father's emphasis on education, I imagine he might have envisioned a different future for you, perhaps as a governess or companion to a noble family." Beatrice considered the question seriously. "There are moments when I wonder what might have been, certainly, but I find genuine satisfaction in my work. There is creativity in bringing beauty to life through needle and thread, and a certain power in creating garments that make the wearer feel confident and admired." She smiled slightly at the young woman in the painting, her face illuminated by both physical and emotional light as she read her letter. Besides, a governess or companion must subjugate her opinions and personality to those she serves. At least as a seamstress, I may think my own thoughts freely, even if I must be circumspect in expressing them. The Duke regarded her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You are a remarkable woman, Miss Lowell." Before Beatrice could formulate a response to this unexpected compliment, the museum's clock chimed 4, breaking the peculiar enchantment of the afternoon. Reality rushed back. She was a seamstress who had spent hours in the private company of one of England's most powerful noblemen. Regardless of the public setting, it was an impropriety that could not be extended. "I must return to the shop," she said, stepping back slightly. "Mrs. Winterbottom will be wondering at my extended absence." The Duke's expression shuttered, his formal mask descending once more. "Of course. I have monopolized your time unconscionably." "Not at all," Beatrice assured him, meaning it sincerely. "This afternoon has been most enlightening." He escorted her to the museum entrance in silence, both of them aware that their unusual interlude was concluding. At the top of the steps, he turned to her with formal courtesy. "Thank you for indulging my invitation, Miss Lowell. I shall have my secretary deliver the details of Lady Harrington's second commission to Mrs. Winterbottom's shop tomorrow." Beatrice curtsied, recognizing the deliberate return to conventional interactions. "It was my pleasure, Your Grace. I look forward to creating another piece for Lady Harrington." With a final nod, the Duke descended the steps to where his carriage waited, the Stratham crest gleaming on its polished door. Beatrice watched him depart, a curious mixture of elation and melancholy settling in her chest. For one extraordinary afternoon, she had glimpsed a world beyond her station, had conversed as an equal with a man whose rank placed him among the most powerful in England. Now, as she turned to make her way back to Bond Street, she must return to the practical reality of her existence. Needles and thread, customers and commissions, the careful economy of a woman who supported herself through respectable labor. Yet as she walked through London's bustling streets, Beatrice knew that something fundamental had shifted within her. The Duke had seen her, not merely as a skilled pair of hands, but as a thinking, feeling human being with valuable opinions and insights. That recognition, however fleeting, had awakened a yearning for connection she had long suppressed in her pursuit of independence and security. "Foolish girl," she murmured to herself as she approached Mrs. Winterbottom's shop. Today was an aberration, not the beginning of a friendship. The Duke has satisfied his curiosity about the unusual seamstress who spoke her mind in a moonlit garden. Tomorrow he will return to his proper sphere, and you to yours. The practical wisdom of this assessment did nothing to ease the unexpected ache in her heart. The Pembury ball was in full swing when Sebastian arrived, fashionably late and thoroughly disinclined to participate in the evening's festivities. The past week had been an exercise in frustrated longing. Ever since his afternoon at the British Museum with Beatrice Lowell, he had found the prescribed social activities of the season increasingly intolerable. The thought of spending another evening making empty conversation with debutantes and their ambitious mothers filled him with profound weariness. Yet duty demanded his presence, particularly as his aunt had taken to reminding him with increasing frequency that his 30th birthday approached and the dukedom required an heir. "Stratham, you've finally condescended to grace us with your presence," Lord Pembrey greeted him at the entrance to the ballroom. "I had begun to fear you might disappoint half the eligible young ladies in London by failing to appear." Sebastian managed a tight smile for his friend. "My apologies for the delay. Estate business required my attention." Pembrey raised a skeptical eyebrow, but refrained from calling out the obvious falsehood. "Well, you're here now, and not a moment too soon. My mother has arranged a particular introduction she's most insistent upon. Lady Sophia Renwick has just arrived from her family's estate in Derbyshire, impeccable lineage, substantial dowry, and reportedly possessed of both intelligence and beauty." "The paragon of womanhood, it would seem," Sebastian replied dryly. "I suppose I must meet this paragon." "Try to contain your enthusiasm," Pembrey muttered, as he led the way through the crowded ballroom. Lady Sophia Renwick was indeed beautiful, tall and slender, with golden hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure and blue eyes that assessed Sebastian with cool calculation as they were introduced. Her manners were impeccable, her conversation perfectly modulated to express appropriate interest without appearing forward, and her dancing form executed with practiced grace. By any objective measure, she represented exactly the sort of bride Sebastian had convinced himself he required: well-born, properly educated, and sufficiently dignified to uphold the prestige of the Stratham dukedom. Yet as they moved through the steps of the quadrille, Sebastian found himself making unfavorable comparisons. Lady Sophia's careful observations about the weather and the season lacked the genuine insight and intellectual curiosity of Beatrice's conversation. Her beauty, while undeniable, seemed somehow artificial when measured against the warm expressiveness of Beatrice's brown eyes. "I understand you have extensive estates in Hampshire, Your Grace," Lady Sophia remarked as they promenaded down the line of dancers. "I am particularly fond of the countryside in that region. The hunting is said to be excellent." "Indeed," Sebastian replied automatically. "Though I confess I have spent less time at Stratham Court in recent years than I might wish. The demands of Parliament and various charitable endeavours keep me primarily in London." Lady Sophia offered a perfectly calibrated smile. "How admirable that you take your responsibilities to the realm so seriously. A true nobleman considers duty before pleasure, does he not?" The sentiment was impeccable, precisely what one would expect from a properly bred, aristocratic daughter. Yet Sebastian found himself wondering what Beatrice might have said in response to the same information. Something unexpected, certainly, perhaps an observation about the architectural merits of country estates, or a question about the condition of tenant farms that would reveal her interest in the human element rather than the superficial prestige. The dance ended, and Sebastian returned Lady Sophia to her mother with flawless courtesy before excusing himself to the card room. He needed a respite from the suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom, where every interaction felt increasingly hollow and performative. As he nursed a glass of brandy in relative solitude, Pembrey found him once more. "You made quite an impression on Lady Sophia," his friend informed him, dropping into the adjacent chair. "Her mother has already begun making discreet inquiries about your preferences in wedding breakfasts." Sebastian grimaced. "Based on a single dance, the woman has exchanged perhaps 50 words with me." 50 words with the Duke of Stratham is apparently sufficient to determine lifelong compatibility when one is in pursuit of a duchess's coronet, Pembrey replied with a sardonic smile. "Besides, what more is truly necessary? She is beautiful, well-born, and wealthy. You are handsome, titled, and in need of an heir. The arrangement makes perfect sense." "Perfect sense," Sebastian echoed hollowly, staring into the amber depths of his brandy. "The ideal marriage of convenience." Pembry studied him with unexpected seriousness. "You sound remarkably unenthusiastic for a man who has spent the past 3 years insisting that marriage should be approached as a rational business arrangement rather than a romantic entanglement." "Do I?" Sebastian took a deliberate sip of his drink, avoiding his friend's perceptive gaze. "Indeed you do," Pembry confirmed. "One might almost suspect you had encountered someone who has caused you to question your long-held convictions on the matter." Sebastian's head snapped up. "What are you implying?" Pembry leaned back in his chair, a smile playing about his lips. "Merely making an observation, old friend. You've been unusually distracted these past weeks. Your attendance at social functions has been erratic. And now, when presented with a young lady who perfectly fulfills your stated requirements for a duchess, you appear thoroughly disinterested." "I've been preoccupied with estate matters," Sebastian insisted. "The northern properties require significant investment if they are to return to profitability." "Of course," Pembry agreed, his tone making it clear he believed nothing of the sort. "Estate matters. Not, for instance, a certain unexpected encounter on Bond Street that Lady Carlisle has been whispering about to anyone who will listen." Sebastian stilled. "What precisely has Lady Carlisle been saying?" "Oh, nothing of real substance," Pembry replied with calculated casualness. "Merely that she observed you in conversation with a working woman, a seamstress, I believe, in a manner that suggested prior acquaintance. Most curious, she thought, for the Duke of Stratham to be on speaking terms with a tradesperson." A cold knot formed in Sebastian's stomach. He had not considered that his impulsive pursuit of Beatrice on Bond Street might have consequences beyond the immediate encounter. Lady Carlisle was a notorious gossip. If she had been spreading stories about his interaction with a seamstress, it could potentially reach Mrs. Winterbottom's shop, creating difficulties for Beatrice in her employment. The woman in question performed an emergency repair for Lady Philippa Wentworth during the Howerton ball, Sebastian explained, adopting a tone of bored indifference. "I merely acknowledged her skill when I happened to encounter her. There is nothing more to the matter." Pembry's expression suggested he was unconvinced by this explanation, but he mercifully dropped the subject. "Well, in any case, you should prepare yourself for increased attention from Lady Sophia and her mother. They have identified you as this season's prime matrimonial target." Sebastian drained the last of his brandy, a sense of suffocating inevitability descending upon him. This was his duty, to select a suitable bride from among the eligible young ladies of the ton, to secure the succession, to uphold the dignity and traditions of the Stratham dukedom. His personal preferences, his unexpected fascination with a brown-eyed seamstress who spoke her mind freely, these were irrelevant luxuries he could not afford. "I should return to the ballroom," he said, rising from his chair. "Lady Howerton will expect me to dance with her daughter." As he moved through the remainder of the evening with mechanical precision, performing the expected courtesies and engaging in the prescribed social rituals, Sebastian felt increasingly like an actor in a play, reciting lines and executing movements that had been determined long before his birth by the accident of his lineage. Only once did his mask slip. As he escorted Lady Cecilia Howerton from the dance floor, he caught sight of a slender figure in a modest brown dress disappearing through a side door, a glimpse so brief he might have imagined it, yet the resemblance to Beatrice was striking enough to cause him to miss a step. "Your Grace," Lady Cecilia inquired, concern evident in her voice, "is something amiss?" Sebastian recovered himself quickly. "Not at all, Lady Cecilia, a momentary distraction, nothing more." But as the evening progressed, he found himself repeatedly scanning the edges of the ballroom. searching for a face he had no reasonable expectation of finding in such a setting. It was madness, he knew. Beatrice Lowell would have no reason to attend the Pembury ball, yet he could not quite suppress the hope that he might encounter her again, if only for a moment. When at last the interminable evening concluded, Sebastian departed with a curious mixture of relief and disappointment. Tomorrow, he told himself as his carriage conveyed him to Stratham House, he would put this inexplicable fascination behind him. He would call upon Lady Sophia Renwick as propriety dictated after their introduction. He would continue the process of selecting a suitable duchess from among the acceptable candidates of the ton. He would do his duty, as he always had. Yet as he gazed out at London's darkened streets, Sebastian could not banish the memory of intelligent brown eyes and forthright conversation, or the unsettling realization that for the first time in his life, duty and desire stood in direct opposition.